The roar of engines filled the frozen sky above Germany. It was February 20th, 1944, deep into the most dangerous phase of World War II's air campaign. The U.S. 8th Air Force had launched another brutal daylight bombing raid over enemy territory, and the sky was thick with silver bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, trudging through flak bursts that bloomed like black flowers in the clouds. Among them flew one aircraft, slower than the rest, trailing smoke from its crippled engines. Inside, 10 men fought to keep their fortress alive. They were alone. Somewhere high above, a German pilot adjusted his gun sight, ready to finish them off. But before he could, a shadow streaked across the sun, fast, sleek, unmistakable. It was a P-51 Mustang. The pilot inside wasn't there for glory. He wasn't following orders. He was about to risk his life and his career to protect a doomed crew. This is a true story of one Mustang pilot who escorted a crippled B-17 bomber for more than 800 miles through enemy skies and was later awarded for his act of courage in secret. To understand what made that day so extraordinary, we have to step back to the world of aerial warfare over Europe in 1944. The air war had turned into a brutal chess game. Allied bombers launched deep into Nazi-occupied territory to destroy aircraft factories, rail lines, and fuel depots, the arteries keeping Hitler's war machine alive. But every mission came at a deadly cost. Thousands of airmen never made it back. A B-17 Flying Fortress might look invincible with its heavy armor and defensive guns, but German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, were tearing into formations like wolves among sheep. At first, the Americans tried to protect their bombers with tight formations, the combat box. The idea was simple. Overlapping fields of machine gun fire would keep the Luftwaffe at bay. But it didn't work. German pilots learned how to exploit weaknesses in those formations, diving in from the front or high above, where the bombers couldn't shoot back. By late 1943, the loss rates were catastrophic. Entire squadrons disappeared on missions to Berlin or Schweinfurt. Crews began calling it the Black Death. Morale dropped. Commanders knew that without fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign could collapse. That's when a new savior appeared, the P-51 Mustang. It was fast, agile, deadly, and most importantly, with its long-range fuel tanks, it could go all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustang turned the tide of the air war, giving the bombers their first real guardian angels. Among those new escorts was a young pilot named Lieutenant William Bill King. He was just 23 years old, a quiet man from Virginia, known for his calm voice and steady hand in the cockpit. His Mustang was called Angel's Playmate, a name he had painted himself on the nose. King wasn't a braggart. He didn't crave dogfights or victory tallies. What drove him was a sense of duty and a deep respect for bomber crews who, day after day, flew straight into hell. On that cold February morning, King and his squad and the Mustangs took off from England to escort the B-17s on a raid over Leipzig. It was supposed to be routine as war could get. But missions like these rarely went according to plan. By midday, the formation had crossed deep into Germany. Anti-aircraft flak began filling the sky. Shrapnel tore through fuselages and fuel lines. The bombers dropped their payloads over the target, and then came the Luftwaffe. Dozens of German fighters swarmed like hornets, slashing through the formations. Bill King's Mustang dived into the fight, guns blazing, the air filled with smoke and burning aluminum. One B-17 after another was hit. Some exploded midair, others limped away, trailing oil and fire. Somewhere in the chaos, King spotted a lone B-17 falling behind. It was losing altitude fast, 2 engines out, the rest sputtering. The bomber's tail was shredded, its left wing peppered with holes. King could see the crew moving inside, still alive, still fighting to keep her airborne. Every instinct told him to rejoin his formation. Escorts weren't supposed to break off. The orders were clear: protect the bombers as a group, not individually. Stragglers were left behind. But something about this one stopped him. Maybe it was the sight of the gunner waving desperately from the top turret. Maybe it was the thought of 10 men, terrified and bleeding, about to be cut apart by German fighters. King made his choice. He throttled down and slid in beside the crippled bomber, wingtip to wingtip, matching its slow, uneven flight. The German fighters noticed. A pair of Messerschmitts broke off from their attack run and swung toward the wounded fortress. King saw the flash of sunlight off their canopies and went after them. His Mustang screamed through the sky, guns hammering. The Messerschmitts peeled away, one trailing smoke. The B-17 kept limping forward. King rejoined it, watching, guarding, for the next several hours. He stayed with them, through cloud banks, over forests, across the deadly landscape of occupied Europe. He knew every minute spent this deep over enemy territory was a gamble. If his fuel ran out, he'd never make it home. But leaving wasn't an option. At one point, the B-17 dropped so low he could see the shadows of trees below them. The pilot must have been fighting just to stay in the air. King radioed for help, but static drowned his voice. No one was coming. The Mustang and the flying fortress, predator and prey turned companions, pushed on together. And somewhere along that long, frozen journey, something remarkable happened. German fighters appeared again, but didn't attack. Some flew close, watching curiously, as if even they understood what they were witnessing. A single fighter escorting a crippled bomber, a strange kind of chivalry in a war that had long forgotten honor. By dusk, they had covered more than 800 miles. The bomber finally crossed the coast and began descending toward England. Its engines were dying, but home was in sight. Bill King circled one last time before turning back to his own airfield, running on fumes. When he landed, his ground crew stared in disbelief. His Mustang's fuel tanks were bone dry. He'd risked everything for one bomber crew, a decision that could have gotten him. When the mission was over, the debriefing room at Debden Airfield fell silent. Lieutenant Bill King handed in his flight log, his hand still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He'd been gone longer than anyone expected. His squadron had returned hours earlier, but King's Mustang only limped in near sunset, almost out of fuel. The crew chief looked at the empty tanks, shook his head, and muttered, "You're lucky you made it back at all." King didn't talk much about what happened up there, just a few words. A B-17 was in trouble. To him, that was enough. But the story of what he'd done slowly began to spread. Ground crews whispered about the crazy pilot who'd flown halfway across Europe to guard a dying bomber. Other pilots couldn't believe it, not because it was impossible, but because it broke every rule they'd ever been taught. Fighter pilots weren't supposed to risk their aircraft for a single bomber. Escort formations had strict orders. Stay together, cover the group, and don't chase stragglers. The logic was simple. If you left your formation, you exposed yourself, and the rest of the bombers lost your protection. But in war, logic sometimes gives way to something far more human. What Bill King had done wasn't about strategy. It was about compassion. 10 men were trapped inside a burning aircraft, and he couldn't just leave them. Later that night, when the B-17's crew finally reached England, the extent of the damage became clear. The bomber's engines were shot to pieces. One wing spar cracked, and its fuselage riddled with cannon holes. It was a miracle the thing was even flyable. The crew could barely believe they'd made it home. Their pilot, Captain James Donovan, later said in a letter, "If that Mustang hadn't stayed with us, we'd have been done for. He scared off 3 attacks I know of. Every time I thought it was over, I'd see him there beside us, like a guardian angel." The story might have ended there, a quiet act of bravery in a war full of chaos. But what makes it even more fascinating is how the world nearly forgot it ever happened. In the months after that mission, the Allied air campaign intensified. The bombing of Germany reached its peak. Cities burned, factories were destroyed, and the Luftwaffe was pushed to its breaking point. The skies became a constant battlefield. Hundreds of acts of heroism unfolded every day, many unrecorded, many forgotten. Bill King's story slipped into the shadows. But here's where the mystery deepens. Records later uncovered show that King's report was classified by higher command, not because he did something wrong, but because his actions technically violated mission protocol. Escort pilots weren't authorized to abandon formation. Publicly acknowledging what he'd done could have embarrassed the chain of command. So the file was buried. For decades, no one outside his squadron knew the full story. The only evidence came from fragments, the bomber crew's letters, logbooks, and a few quiet mentions in memoirs. Then, in the 1980s, a retired Air Force historian stumbled upon an old mission record marked special case. Inside were two reports, one from Lieutenant William King and another from the crew of the B-17 Red Rose. The details matched perfectly. A crippled bomber escorted across 800 miles by a lone Mustang. The historian realized he'd uncovered something extraordinary, a story of moral courage that defied regulations but embodied everything the airmen stood for. And when he tracked down Bill King, now an older man living quietly in Virginia, King was stunned. He had no idea anyone remembered. "I didn't think it mattered anymore," he said softly. "I just did what I had to do." There's a certain poetry in that humility, because it reflects a whole generation of airmen who never sought fame. To them, courage wasn't about medals. It was about doing the right thing when no one was watching. But this story isn't just about one man and one bomber. It's about something deeper, the strange, almost unspoken brotherhood of the skies. During the air war over Europe, pilots on both sides develop a unique code, not written, not spoken, but understood. Even amid the savagery, there were moments of respect between enemies. One famous example occurred in December 1943, when German ace Franz Stigler refused to shoot down a crippled B-17 over Bremen. The bomber's tail gunner was dead, half the crew wounded, and yet they kept flying. Stigler could have destroyed them easily. Instead, he escorted them out of German airspace, saluted the American pilot, and turned away. Years later, that American pilot, Charles Brown, would meet Stigler in person, and they would become lifelong friends. Historians often compare Bill King's act to that same spirit, a moment where decency overcame orders. The difference is, King's compassion wasn't toward an enemy, but toward his own comrades. Still, it came from the same place, an unshakable belief that life, even in war, had value. Now, imagine the tension of that flight, an aircraft flying slower than it should, losing altitude every minute, the Mustang pilot constantly scanning the horizon for threats. Every cloud could hide danger. Every flicker of shadow could mean death. At one point, according to the B-17 crew's navigator, German fighters appeared again. But instead of attacking, they held their distance. "It was the strangest thing," the navigator wrote. "They circled us once, looked at the Mustang flying beside us, and then turned away. Maybe they saw what he was doing and just let us go." That moment feels almost mythical, an unspoken truce born from respect. Back on the ground, maintenance crews studying the bomber were astonished it had stayed airborne. One propeller had seized entirely. Hydraulic systems were gone. The tail gun had been sheared off completely. "It should have fallen apart in midair," one engineer said. Something or someone kept it alive. And perhaps that's why the story stayed alive, too, even in whispers. Because every man who heard it recognized what it represented. A small flicker of humanity in a world gone mad. In the decades that followed, aviation enthusiasts tried to track down the full details. Letters were exchanged. Archives opened. Finally, after nearly 40 years, the Air Force quietly confirmed the incident's authenticity. In 1987, at a private ceremony attended by only a few veterans, William King was presented with a distinguished Flying Cross. No media, no cameras. The award citation simply read, "For extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion in protection of Allied aircrew." He never spoke publicly about the event. When asked why he'd done it, his answer was simple: "Because they were my boys. I couldn't let them die alone." That's the kind of answer that can't be taught in flight school. The morning sun poured through the windows of a small air museum in Virginia. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries the weight of memory. In one corner stood a faded photograph of a young man in a leather jacket, leaning against a gleaming P-51 Mustang. The caption read simply, "Lieutenant William Bill King, 352nd Fighter Group, 8th Air Force." For most visitors, it was just another face from history. But those who knew the story understood what that photo truly represented. Not just a man, not just a machine, but a choice made in the loneliest, most dangerous sky imaginable. In his later years, King rarely spoke about the war. Friends said he preferred the silence of his workshop, tinkering with old model airplanes. Once, when asked by a local reporter about the 800-mile escort, he smiled faintly and said, "It was a long flight. They needed help, and I had fuel." Nothing more. No speeches, no drama. But behind that quiet understatement was a moment that had changed 10 lives, and in a small way, captured the moral heartbeat of an entire generation. Let's return for a moment to that day in 1944, to the final moments of the flight that would define him. The crippled B-17, its name Red Rose, was barely holding together. 2 engines had seized completely. A third was coughing smoke. The crew inside could smell oil and cordite, their oxygen systems half frozen. Every vibration felt like a death sentence. Captain James Donovan, the bomber's pilot, later recalled that his control yoke felt like dragging a dead elephant. Each turn required everything he had left. The crew was exhausted, wounded, and terrified. But every time Donovan looked out his window, the Mustang was still there, steady, silent, refusing to leave. When they finally crossed the English Channel, the weather worsened. Heavy fog rolled in, hiding the coastline. Donovan radioed the nearest base, barely able to speak. "This is Red Rose, 2 engines out, wounded aboard. Any field with a strip long enough. We're coming down." King stayed with them until the very last minute, circling low as the bomber descended through the mist. The B-17's landing gear failed to deploy fully. It slammed into grass, skidding across the airfield in a shower of mud and sparks. When the wreckage came to rest, the crew stumbled out, alive. Bruised, bleeding, but alive. King's Mustang flashed past once more, rocking its wings in salute before banking west toward Debden. It was the last thing the Red Rose crew saw before collapsing beside their battered plane. For weeks after that mission, they tried to find out who the pilot was. But the military bureaucracy was a maze. Records were incomplete, names missing. All they knew was that a Mustang-marked Angel's playmate had saved them. They called him the Guardian. Decades later, when they finally tracked him down, some of the surviving crewmen met King in person. It was an emotional reunion. Old men now, gray-haired and slow-moving, shaking hands in silence. No one spoke for a long time. Then one of them, the tail gunner, now in his 70s, said softly, "We always wondered what kind of man you were." King chuckled and replied, "Just another pilot trying to get home." But there was something in his eyes, the look of a man who had carried the memory of that day his entire life. When he received his Distinguished Flying Cross in 1987, the ceremony was deliberately kept quiet, not because his act was shameful, but because by then the war had faded into history. The world had moved on. Only a few of the men who truly understood were still around. Yet even in secrecy, the recognition mattered. It meant that the story wouldn't vanish, that somewhere in the dusty files of history, a record would remain. 1 pilot, 1 bomber, 800 miles. And what's most remarkable is that this wasn't an isolated case. Across the war, countless unsung acts of heroism went unnoticed. Airmen who gave their oxygen masks to others, navigators who flew crippled planes home on 1 engine, mechanics who kept squadrons alive with spare parts and miracles. Bill King's story became a symbol of them all, the invisible courage that never made the newspapers. Historians who studied the case point out something striking. During the war, there was an official effort to suppress stories that might encourage pilots to disobey formation orders. The Air Force feared that if every pilot tried to be a lone hero, missions would fall apart. So acts like King's were buried, quietly honored but never broadcast. But time has a way of correcting the record. Today, aviation historians speak of King in the same breath as Franz Stigler and Charles Brown, not because they shared the same mission, but because they shared the same soul. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are still flickers of light, acts that defied logic, rules, and sometimes even survival itself. One can only imagine the silence of that cockpit, the endless hum of the engine, the icy wind claw at the canopy, the sun sinking low the fields of France. A young man, alone, fly beside a dying giant of aluminum and fire. No orders, no certainty, just a moral compass stronger than fear. In that vast emptiness, he must have wondered if anyone would ever know, if anyone would ever understand what it felt like to look out and see death in every direction and choose deliberately not to run. When Bill King passed away in the early 2000s, his story resurfaced once more. Journalists pieced together the mission logs, letters, and oral histories. The headlines read, "The Mustang Who Wouldn't Leave." Veterans from both sides of the war sent letters of respect. Even German historians admired the courage of a man who had risked everything for others, not out of glory, but out of decency. Today, a small plaque at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford bears his name, alongside a restored P-51 Mustang. The inscription reads, "He flew not for medals nor fame, but for those who could not fly alone." When visitors walk past it, they might not realize they're standing before one of the quietest legends of the Second World War. But if they stop, if they listen closely, they might almost hear it, the echo of engines high above the clouds, and two aircraft flying together against all odds. The Red Rose never flew again. Its wrecked fuselage was scrapped a few months later, but fragments of its aluminum skin, battered bullet-pocked, were kept by the surviving crew. Years later, one of those pieces found its way into King's hands. It was mounted on a small wooden plaque with a note, "To the pilot who never left us behind." He kept it on his desk for the rest of his life. And maybe that's the truest ending to this story. Not the medal, not the ceremony, but the bond between men who survived together when survival seemed impossible. Because war often erases humanity, but sometimes, in rare moments, it reveals it. And somewhere above the clouds of memory, a single Mustang still flies beside a wounded fortress. Forever on guard, forever keeping pace, a symbol of loyalty, compassion, and the quiet power of one man's choice.